Sure, yeah. Broadly, my work deals with kind of policing regimes and security regimes from a kind of transnational perspective. So I'm both interested in the ways in which particular places and spaces are policed in different localities, but a lot of my past work and the book project that I came here to present on today is really about the entanglements of different policing regimes across different jurisdictions and places. So I've been really interested in how sort of policing logics travel, how technologies are produced and mutate across different places of the world, and how those sort of come together and coalesce in different sort of constellations in different places. So that's kind of the broad contours of it. Some of that work is dealt with stuff around counterterrorism policing, but also more broadly sort of counterinsurgency, urban kind of pacification and so on. So yeah, in terms of the focus has been mostly on Palestine, Israel, and India, but my work has also taken me to the UK and some other places as well. Initially, sort of the transnational dimensions of police, I think one of the things that first spurred my interest in it was sort of the emergence of this tactic called kettling. And I think the first time I had heard about it or encountered it was at a G20 protest in London around, I think it was the year 2009, I believe. And it came up, I think, later in relation to the student protest the year later. But after traveling back home to Canada after my experience there, there was also another G20 meeting in my hometown of Toronto, and there's a lot of discussion about the sort of mobilization of kettling as a major tactic for mass arrest. So it's one of the biggest mass arrests in Canadian history. And so as I was just starting out my sort of doctoral studies, I was quite interested in sort of traveling police theory or police strategy or tactics. And that led me to a wider sort of interest in homeland security and counterterror policing and the ways in which sort of particular tactics or logics develop in one place and then possibly travel to others. So that kettling was kind of, I think, the first example that really caught my attention. Yeah, so the book is called Fabricating Homeland Security, Police Entanglements Across India and Palestine, Israel, and it's based on more than a decade of ethnographic work across Palestine, Israel, India, and the UK. And it was really trying to trace the emergence of this thing called Homeland Security in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, and how both the logics of Homeland Security and its sort of spatial reordering of domestic spaces travel between different places. So the book sort of traces the aftermath, in particular, of the 2008 Mumbai attacks in India, where a large number of people were killed and maimed, and kind of the reverberation of that, one of which was to try to make a push into India as a new sort of homeland security market. So through ethnographic work, following different kinds of private actors and state actors across these different jurisdictions, I try to trace the ways in which that project developed over about a decade, through direct engagement with security, salespeople, arms dealers, that kind of stuff. The event was great. Got some really interesting questions, and yeah, it was a nice opportunity to share some of the findings. It's been a long work in progress. It's consumed a lot of time, so I really enjoyed the opportunity to get people's reflections and try to answer some questions, but I really appreciated the depth of the engagement. So I guess it depends how you define global governance. I suppose one recent project that has just sort of culminated with my first sort of co-written article on this topic is around migration deterrence, quote unquote. And this is something you hear a lot about, particularly with the small boats crisis in the UK. You hear a lot of politicians invoking the need to deter would-be migrants from entering small boats and coming to the UK. And in the paper, we try to excavate kind of the origins of an etymology of deterrence. So as I'm sure people will know, deterrence crops up in a lot of different policy fields, everything from nuclear deterrence to police science and so on. You often hear about deterring crime or deterring migration or deterring war, for example. But one of the new sort of interests that I have is sort of where this actual logic comes from. And in the paper, we sort of trace it to the origins of police science in like the 19th century. people like Patrick Calhoun, for example, who's sort of one of the early progenitors of what came to be known as police science. And sort of, we think about it as a form of public terror, basically. But I think in terms of global governance, for me, deterrence is something that's often invoked, but there's very little follow through about like what it actually does, or whether it is in fact a thing, or whether it is simply a buzzword that people like to invoke. So I think, this recent work has kind of opened my eyes up a little bit about, I guess, trying to think a bit more about what deterrence does in the world and how it sort of crops up in all these different policy fields and seems to sort of like operate under a similar logic, but in my estimation, it's not necessarily all that it seems, I guess. Yeah, very much. I think I think for students, having been a student for many years of my life as well, I think book talks in particular are a way to see a large piece of work that someone's worked on for many years. And I think it can be quite rich and illuminating to see how one person has sort of pulled together a project over and all the sort of work that goes into it. And I know people who write books, I think, spend a lot of time by themselves writing and revising and so on. And I think having the opportunity to sort of engage with external voices and students, I think students would benefit a lot from also finding out about the process of research and how researchers go about their work and how they come to be interested in the things that they are, but also sort of how they carry out their own research projects. So, I would imagine that it would be something that would be quite useful for a range of different students.